welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Manuel Martín Rodríguez, who is a professor of Latino literature at University of California Merced. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Your book that you're working on right now has a working title of From Good Neighbors to Bad Hombres, and I understand that you got started on this area of research because of a question your son asked you. Can you tell us about that?
Right, yes. When my son was young, he was very much into The Lion King. And we kept watching this every day, several times a day, many times. And one day he just asked me why one of the hyenas spoke Spanish. And I didn't have an answer for him right there because I may have not even noticed. And I started thinking about it and started thinking about possibilities for explaining something like that to somebody as young as my son was. And the only way I could make sense of that is the political, social context when the film was made and released. And so I started there, and I gave him the answer that I thought it was because of how the movie presented a conflict between two different kind of animals who lived separated by a border, and how the hyenas cross into lion territory, and how that could mean at a different level that in addition to talking about lions and hyenas, the movie might be talking about something else.
Right.
So that's
the lions weren't building a wall or anything, were they?
Not yet. But I wonder if the Lion King had been filmed nowadays, if that would have been featured.
So your overall project then is to kind of look at how Mexicans have been portrayed in the media in the United States, right?
Right. The Mexicans are the central focus of the book, but I also deal with other Latino groups that are also represented. Occasionally, you get some Central Americans, other Latinos that are not, whose backgrounds are not described, and so though Mexicans are the bulk of the book, there are other areas that I also study there.
Well, so if we look at this historically, how did this start out, and can we talk about how it's evolved here?
Sure. The interesting phenomenon here is that Mexico and Mexicans were featured from the very beginning of the film industry. In fact, the film industry is tied directly to Mexico and Mexicans, and the relocation of the studios to California to take advantage of the extra hours of daylight. And so in the silent films, Mexicans are already featured, and they continue to be featured in the transition towards the so-called talkies. And in fact, something interesting that is not often discussed is a Mexican individual is credited with, quote-unquote, inventing the subtitles, providing subtitles in Spanish for movies that were in English when movies had the little descriptive signs, and vice versa. And so there are documented studies by historians of audiences in Tucson going to the movies to learn Spanish with the subtitles that this person had invented.
It's a handy tool. I suppose people do that a lot.
Right. I mean, it's like, you pick a book in another language to learn. This was done with the movies. Yeah. And so the interesting part when it comes to children's entertainment is that it was not until World War II that depiction started. And the Disney studio was the only one that didn't have to close during the war because of the war effort. In fact, it was used heavily for propaganda shorts against the Nazi and the Japanese, but also for two films that were part of the Good Neighbor policy of the Roosevelt administration. So Disney was sent to Latin America to prepare two films, and that's where Mexicans first appeared in animated feature films, so long films, not in cartoons.
Those aren't films that we would know today?
You might. They have been released recently in the 90s, and I'm sure since then. They're called Saludos Amigos. That's the first one of the two. And then The Three Caballeros, which is by far much more popular. Yeah. Interestingly, Saludos Amigos, which being the first, somehow skipped Mexico. So they went to South America. Yeah. And so there was a huge reaction in the Spanish language newspapers in the US complaining that Mexico was overlooked, and the government in Mexico as well got involved. And Disney claimed all along that they had already envisioned featuring Mexico in the Three Caballeros, which they did. And so that's the beginning. And we have Mexicans then and there, and then there's a huge gap in film until pretty much the 21st century.
Really? Yeah.
We have a lot in cartoons, but not so much in film.
One of the interesting things that I'm aware of is the trajectory of the Speedy Gonzales debate. I think he first appears around 1963. Am I right?
Yes, just about. Maybe even earlier.
Yeah. Okay. 53. I'm sorry.
53.
Yeah, 53. I'm
in
sorry.
the 50s.
And he, at one point, he was considered sort of offensive, right? And there was an attempt to sort of suppress those cartoons,
Right.
but it met with some objections from the Mexican-American community.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, the first thing is that I think the way you phrase it is very interesting, because when we're dealing with representation, there are always multiple perspectives and multiple messages, and how people decode and recodify those messages. So saying that this is negative or this is bad or this is good makes little sense, because somebody else might see it differently. And so as we analyze what representation means, we're always working from one specific perspective. So in the case of Speedy Gonzales, I think it is obvious that some of the elements portrayed there are not particularly positive. There is a representation of laziness, representations of taking advantage of certain things.
Yeah, he has a brother who's not so Speedy Gonzales,
Exactly.
right? And he's the negative, the much more negative.
Right, but even
portrayal,
in the character himself of Speedy Gonzales, there are exaggerated features that for some people
He has
prove
a
to be
hat that's
offensive.
bigger than he is, for
Exactly.
instance, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so what happened in that case is that as time progressed and people became more aware of stereotypes and what they potentially did or what people thought they did, then the campaign to remove it from the areas of entertainment that were directly targeting,
media canon, if you will.
right, targeting the young consumers or the young viewers, that's when that campaign started, and also connected to, for instance, the suppression of the Frito Bandito lay character.
Potato chips,
Exactly. And so, but because representation has this ambiguous side, as you rightly pointed out, immediately there was a demand for restoration of the cartoon. And so that is the last time I saw that list is a huge list of signatures. Many of them are Spanish language surnames, so we can only assume that many of them are
and
Latinos.
organizations as well, I
Right,
understand,
absolutely.
I think in defense of the character, they're saying they always outsmarted everybody else in the cartoon, right?
Yes. The one time when you win and that is not enough, right? And this is also an important point. You know, negative doesn't only mean that you are a failure, that you somehow do not succeed. You can succeed and also be stereotyped.
Yeah, and I'm obviously, other ethnic groups have had issues. The Italians with the Godfather movies, and I remember my mother's Greek family complaining that Zorba the Greek wasn't played by a Greek, and it's a common issue in America, right?
It's one of the points I make that do not relate to Latinos in my book and in my research, right? So the first Disney film, animated film, is Snow White, and then immediately in 1940 you get Pinocchio. And Pinocchio is interesting because you have Italian characters, and
very negative.
You have.
I'm using the word negative all the time here.
Well,
but it was
it is
not a positive one.
It is negative most of the time for most people, right? You have, on the one hand, Pinocchio, who gets into trouble but is portrayed as innocently falling into all kinds of traps and all that, but eventually he's good and honest and will make it. And if you look at how he is depicted, he speaks non-accented English. He's well-mannered, well-behaved. And then you have Stromboli, who is an older Italian with a thick accent, with a greedy character, very sinister. And so that's when you watch something like this, chances are you would say, okay, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy immediately.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's really about assimilation, isn't it? Because Pinocchio wants to assimilate, right? And the other character is kind of rejected the notion, I think, right?
That's how I read the film symbolically, allegorically in my book, right? As we say, becoming a real boy, in the book it meant something, but in the movie it clearly means becoming mainstream, becoming American, which is what Stromboli could never aim for.
Yeah. So now you're, of course, looking at more current movies and animated films. Right. So tell me about some of the things you're looking at right now.
Well, the big changes in representation took place around 2014 and 2017, when two new films, very different from the past, were released. The first one was The Book of Life, and the second was Coco. And they are very similar, but also very different. And both of them actually deal with the celebration of the Day of the Dead. And it was almost an uncanny coincidence that after decades of silence or lack of representation, that two films will be released so close to one another, centered on Mexicans and certain on a particular aspect of Mexican culture. There was even a debate about potential plagiarism that was clearly cleared in the negative. The director of the earlier film said he did not think Coco was plagiarizing his film. But the fact remains that they are centered around the same cultural area and about the same people. They are both animated. They were both very successful at a different scale. When The Book of Life was released, it was a major success, but then Coco, like almost anything Disney does, dwarfed on that success by catapulting the film into more than 90 awards, major audiences all around, and extreme popularity. And people were really, really happy in general. And so was I. I mean, I watched the film and I liked it a lot. But the analytical, professorial side of me, because I was already trained to do that, and I had trained my children to do that, and they would be the one pointing things to me down the road if I didn't, immediately saw that it also had a couple of problematic issues that I wanted to explore, and I ended up exploring them in a publication. Well, for instance, the movie is said to be a love letter to Mexico, because the producers, people making the film, love Mexico, and that's wonderful. But as I point out, the problem with love letters is that we hear the voice of the person who loves, not the voice of the loved one. Mm-hmm. And so while some people were celebrating, many people were celebrating how Mexico was represented, the fact is Mexico was not representing itself. And so that's one point. A second point, perhaps...
And the nationality of the director and the script writers was...
Yes. None of them were Mexican. One of the people of Mexican descent involved was promoted to co-director, but he was not the director, and he was added kind of later into the game. The other thing that I found strange is that much as the movie was celebrated for representing Mexicanness in the wide sense, including Mexicans in the U.S., the fact is no Mexicans in the U.S. are represented in the film. The film is set in a nondescript, fictional, rural small town in Mexico.
Yeah.
To have two movies still clinging to the idea of rural Mexico, secluded from time and geographical changes, really doesn't make much sense for the story themselves and also for the audiences watching them.
Well, so if we look at this film, Coco, what's the intended audience here? What does Disney have in mind? What's their motivation when they put something like that together?
I think one of the changes in the 21st century is that the U.S. has become much more multicultural than it ever was. And you see very clearly how that was reflected in the evolution of animation starting around 1989. I mean, Disney had been experiencing a pretty rough period until Eisner became the CEO and turned things around. And one of the ways in which things were turned around is if you look at the films as a list of films, you realize that, as I said, starting in '89 and then one per year at least, you have one film focusing on one ethnic or national group every single year.
Oh, really?
You get the French, you get the Gypsies, you get everybody, Hawaiians, even non-existent civilizations like Atlantis. And somewhere along that line, somebody might have noticed that they had represented some 20 plus nationalities and not Mexicans.
Okay.
And if you're trying to capture a market, a population that is now Latinos are estimated to be 18% of the population and 23% of moviegoers, that is a big market. And so I don't want to say that it was only commercial interest. I mean, I see in the documentaries that accompany the DVD with the film, you see what appear to be honest declarations of love to Mexico and interest in Mexican culture. And so it's not just marketing, but it is marketing. And I mean, these movies cost millions to make and produce millions and generate. So what you see is that in that history, they have been tapping different segments of the audience at some times. And unfortunately, because they have lacked oftentimes the consulting that they could have benefited from, oftentimes the audiences that were targeted have complained about the films. Case in point was Aladdin, was one of those that really drew a very negative response. And in fact, the film was altered when it was distributed on DVD to get part of at least one of the most offensive songs in the original. And something similar happened when they started filming Coco. It wasn't called Coco at the time, it was called Day of the Dead. And they thought that they could go to a legal office and copyright the words Day of the Dead, right?
They wanted to do that, yeah.
And so everybody went up in arms, you can't copyright that.
Right.
We celebrate that, have celebrated that for ages. And that's when they realized that they needed a little bit more consulting to do. And I'm glad that they did incorporate many consultants, and the talent is mostly Latinos, not necessarily Mexicans or people of Mexican descent. And the movie really gained a lot. In fact, some of the fierce critics of the original project became some of these consultants. So they really did turn things around to a large extent. I mean, as I say, I and others still have seen things that are not to our liking, but that's going to be the case with representation always, as we were discussing earlier. What pleases you may not please me, and so on.
Yeah. So you grew up in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
What was the reputation of Mexico in films in Spain?
It's slightly different and also similar to a large extent. So we have historical ties to Mexico that are very different than those the U.S. has. And for whatever it's worth, in both cases, it involves war and conquest. So it's equally aggressive on both our parts with respect to Mexico. But beyond that, and we do have a common language for the most part. I mean, Mexico also has multiple indigenous languages as well, but Spanish being the most popular spoken language in Mexico, that's a connection that we have. So we have always been exposed to Mexican literature and vice versa, and some other products of popular culture. But then we also had the dubbed Spanish language versions of Hollywood materials in which we'll get all the stereotypes about Mexico. So many of the stereotypes about Mexicans that circulated here also circulated there. And I remember friends of mine as children telling jokes about Mexicans and whatnot, using exactly the same stereotypes. So,
of course, they were seeing American films and things too, right? So there was some of that.
It was mostly American films, American cartoons. We had a film industry that was developing. When I was a kid, it was a dictatorship, so it was all regulated. And so the boom of the Spanish film industry came a little later when I was in my teen years. And that changed quite a bit. I mean, and in fact, one of the major Spanish filmmakers, Luis Buñuel, was exiled in Mexico, and that for us was also an eye-opening about the other Mexico that you didn't get to see. So he made a good number of films, not for children, while in Mexico, and those sometimes subjected to censorship, other times not made it to Spain, even if he was politically exiled. And so we grew up seeing also those Mexican movies. And of course, we got some of the very active Mexican movie, some of the products of very active Mexican movie industry. So we had a big share of Mexican movies, and those presented a different kind of image.
So if we think about the films that were made prior to World War II, just after World War II, the cultural impact that they had was sort of incidental to the producers, I would imagine, right?
It was a different kind of impact. I mean, it had.
I mean, they weren't cognizant of it. They weren't.
I think they were. I
You
think
do?
They were. Yeah, because I mean, these were two movies that were actually made. They were requested to make the movies, and so the U.S. was
the Disney
movies. Yes.
Prior to World War. Yeah.
They were during
World War II.
The U.S. was very concerned about the inroads that Nazi Germany was doing in trying to secure allies in Latin America. And so it would have been very dangerous for the Nazis to gain any foothold in Latin America because of proximity and whatnot. And
so even before this was an issue with the public, this was something that they were actually aware of and concerned with. That's very interesting. Go ahead. Yeah.
It was a diplomatic mission.
Yeah.
And so it was a goodwill effort, and the U.S. realized that it had been treating with a sort of a heavy hand Latin America up to that point.
Yeah.
And now the U.S. was confronted with two things: the Nazi, by the door kind of danger, but also the loss of markets in Europe. And so new markets had to be developed. And they clearly conceived Brazil as the big market because Brazil is so big and the population is really remarkable. And so both films actually feature Brazil in addition to other Latin American countries. So the idea was, okay, we need to secure their allegiance to the Allied armies, and also we need to see how we can develop these industrial relationships. And this is something very clear in the political context because Mexico had this party that was also represented in the U.S. Southwest called the Sinarquista, and they had been contacted by Nazi authorities with some kind of strange promises that if the Nazis won the war, they would get the Southwest back to Mexico and things like that.
Give them Texas back.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine the worth of promises like that. But the truth is that the Sinarquista had a pro-Nazi ideology for the most part.
Yeah.
The fascists, at least.
It's interesting how the stereotypes, though, carry across the ocean even.
Right.
I know we both studied literature. I know Shakespeare was still using stereotypes from the morality plays.
Right.
I think Richard III was basically the vice character.
Yeah.
And so it's an easy shorthand if you're writing a script or directing something to try to just convey a lot with one image or one look. Do you think that we're getting away from that today? I mean, do you think there's more of an effort to...
I think we have more awareness of it, but the shorthand part that you mentioned remains dominant. I mean, you only have 1.5 hours to tell a story, 2 hours, 2.5, depending on the film. And so whatever you can do in terms of economy of representation gets to be used. So you have stereotypes, you have stock situations, stock characters who are not necessarily stereotypical, but nonetheless very limited. And so those creates a sort of, I like to compare it with grammar. So you have a grammar that is already fixed that you use to speak, to communicate. And so this is the same case. Now, the unfortunate part of certain grammatical aspects is that they come oftentimes with a loaded version of the world. And so if you have stereotypes and stock characters become part of that vocabulary, that grammar, then they do trigger a monolithic uniform reaction. And so that's where potentially the issue is. And
it gets more and more embedded as it goes on.
Exactly. One of the things that I've noticed that is a positive sign is some of these films, even films for children, are already playing with the stereotypes. And so there is a film that I always show in my classes Scooby-Doo and the Monster of Mexico, where you are shown very stereotypical scenes,
Yeah.
triggering very easy to predict reactions to be proven wrong a few seconds later. And
Later in
so
the show,
that's where
yeah.
the fun of the movie is.
Well, that gives us a lot to look for when we see these going forward here. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Manuel Martin Rodriguez for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.